understand our relationship to rivers in an age of ecological crisis. Join us and learn about rights of rivers, riverside, water kinship, community building, and approaches to environmental, land, and social justice. It is time we unite with global river guardians.
Hi everyone, and welcome to an Advaya and Guardians Worldwide screening of the incredible Patagonia film ARTIFISHAL. This is a film about people, rivers, and the fight for the future of wild fish and the environment that supports them. It explores wild salmon's slide towards extinction, threats posed by fish hatcheries and fish farms, and our continued loss of faith in nature. My name is Christabel Reed, and I'm a co-founder of Advaya. This is a global platform for transformative education that explores the intersections of ecology, cosmology, and community. After the screening that will start in a couple minutes' time, I have the joy of hosting a live discussion and Q&A with an incredible group of river and water guardians. Joining us is the film director and producer, Josh Murphy, Amy Cordalis, Yurok Tribe General Counsel, who's dedicated to defending and advancing self-governance for her tribe. And Amy comes from a long line of Yuroks who have fought to defend their rights and their heritage. Paul Wilson, an incredible photographer, the chief storyteller for Rios to Rivers, an incredible project I'm excited to learn more about with you, and Klamath Tribes member. Leanne Foe of Drinkable Rivers, who's a founder, incredible project also. Leah Doriel, Oceanic Global founder and director, and Matt Mellon from Eco Hustler, who's the founder of Eco Hustler and has done a brilliant campaigning against fish farms and salmon farms in the UK and Scotland. So as you're watching the film, please jot down any questions you might have or put them in the comments if you're able to do that through Facebook or YouTube. Please join in this conversation, amplify the important topics which are being discussed today. The primary goal of this event is to spotlight these important issues, to spark dialogue, to platform these incredible stories that must be learned and understood, and to encourage change in the way that we think about river and fish conservation and fishery management. And as Patagonia write, the common ground we all seem to share is a love of rivers and an interest in seeing wild fish return in greater abundance. I really want to learn how I can take direct positive action in my local context, and stop othering other people as being responsible for conservation, for protection, for defending, for consciousness shifting. I want to learn how I can stand in solidarity with global water guardians and river defenders, but by taking local action in my own personal context. Because human bodies are 70% water. We are literally water. And I think healing this water to human relationship is essential to how we heal our relationship with the earth and how we can treat, protect, defend, restore, but most importantly, to honor and revere water as an element, as a sacred element, and water bodies as sources of life around the world. And if you're interested in learning more and learning directly with Global River Guardians, you can join an online course curated by Guardians Worldwide in Advaya that's starting tomorrow. It's a 3-month course online, taught by 25 incredible teachers, incredible authors, writers, guardians from around the world, I think from 15 different nations. And we're going to be exploring somatic, as in bodily, legal, cultural, practical, spiritual approaches to water guardianship. And you can find out more at www.riverguardians.co, not com.co. And the code ARTIFISHAL25 gives you 25% off. But also bear in mind, like with all Advaya events and courses, if anyone ever needs a bursary, like as in a pay what you can or free way into that, then you're always very, very welcome. So you can just write to us. I would like to thank Patagonia for letting us stream their brilliant film, for the generosity of the panelists for sharing their time and wisdom with us, and for our wonderful partners who have supported us along the way: Unify, International Rivers, Rewild, Oceanic Global, Eco Hustler, and Got Soul Films. And I hope this film sparks within all of us the journey, or continuing along a journey towards establishing thriving ecosystems and therefore thriving biodiversity thriving community, and thriving humans. So enough from me. I'll see you after the film. It's about an hour and 20 minutes long, and that when we're back together again, we'll have the brilliant panelists with us. So enjoy and send us in your questions and your reflections. Thank you.
Humans typically adopt a command and control approach to environmental problem solving. Here's the problem: we can engineer our way around it. Technology is great in so many realms of human experience, but when you try to apply manipulation and control of ecosystems through technology, you're often successful early on, but then problems creep in later on.
One of the things that our modern society has done is to industrialize all the living things around us. We have factories for living things, and that includes fish. Humans believe everything is for us, so if there are animals in the world, surely they are for us, and surely we should just do anything we want with them or to them. And isn't that great? Well, I don't quite see it that way. Fish are wild animal populations. They're not made to, or evolved to, or really capable of being used at the rate that people use them. The whole myth of the Garden of Eden is a place where everything was granted and everything was beautiful. And then because of human hubris, we were doomed to a life of toil. We are certainly casting ourselves out of the garden and dooming ourselves to a life of toil through our hubris.
This is a king salmon, but we refer to them as a Chinook salmon, which is their more formal name. This bath here, which has carbon dioxide, it anesthetizes the fish, knocks them out, and the guys are pulling the fish out if they're ripe when they're Chinook salmon, and we spawn the fish by inserting a needle into their body cavity, which forces air in and pushes all the eggs out. And then after they're spawned here, they go to the other side of the table there, and we're biologically sampling the fish. Would you like to touch one? Feels kind of slimy.
Coleman National Fish Hatchery is a mitigation hatchery. We're here because of Shasta Dam being built in 1942. So the purpose of Coleman National Fish Hatchery is to mitigate for the loss of habitat due to Shasta Dam. The creation of the dam prevented about 180 miles of river access for the salmon. So here at Coleman National Fish Hatchery, we raise fall Chinook salmon, late fall Chinook salmon, and steelhead. Our production goal here is 12 million. So we released 12 million and we're trying to get a 1% return. We would like 120,000 fish return. 90,000 of that would be caught in the ocean and in river sport fishery. 20,000 back to the hatchery, and then 10,000 back to Battle Creek. Why do we need hatcheries? Well, I think, population's going up. Water's, a concern, and so if you still would like to see salmon, I think you're going to need to have hatcheries, unfortunately. It would be nice to think that there would be enough water and environment to support salmon populations, but without hatcheries, I don't think that would be a reality.
This is the Baker River Dam, 265 feet high, which stops millions of salmon from returning to their spawning grounds above the dam without help. So the United States Bureau of Fisheries has stepped in and saved the day by providing a free ride upstream. It's the only way the salmon can be saved from dashing themselves to pieces against the stonework far below.
Humans have always thought themselves as superior to nature. It's got us into a lot of trouble.
When the Euro-Americans came, they believed the natural world was a big warehouse storing commodities that they were obliged to make use of, to take. They asked Spencer Baird, the U.S. Fish Commissioner, what could they do to ensure that the salmon runs would go on forever. Baird told them, you're not going to be able to protect the habitat through regulations because they'd be unenforceable. You're not going to be able to protect them from dams because progress is going to demand that dams be built. And so he said, what you need to do is take up artificial propagation.
The people that originally were the fish and wildlife scientists weren't. They were agriculturalists. And since the 1800s, our fish and wildlife agencies have been dominated by an agricultural mentality. Just like a farm, you raise them, you put them out, you harvest them. That's the basis for fish and wildlife management in the US for ages and ages.
The fact is, salmon must spend part of their life out in the wild. And it wasn't until in the 70s that we really started evaluating what are we doing when we release hatchery fish into a stream. The use of hatcheries was a promise that you could have salmon and you could also have the benefits of developing the river. Put that next to the fact that 40% of the salmon are extinct in their historic range and the rest are protected by the Endangered Species Act, you would have to say that that story didn't protect the things that we value, the salmon.
We've been relying on those same runs of fish, those wild fish, since the beginning of time. When your health is their health, right? You're married in that way, and I think that union creates the sacredness. To have that relationship with a single species is real special. You think about like the Sioux people and the buffalo back in the day before everything was colonized. But that relationship, unfortunately, was severed. If we let these runs go, then they are gone. And I do not think that we, as people who are on this planet now, should be okay with allowing salmon to go extinct on our watch.
So the average person, when they see a salmon, they see a salmon. They see a finished product. And it's perhaps at the end of their fishing line, perhaps in a restaurant on their plate. But they don't see the complexity of things that went into making that salmon.
Salmon, I think, have the most complicated, you could also say wondrous life histories of, I guess, any fish. They start life by hatching from eggs in a stream, and then they go out to the ocean. When they come back, they're much, much bigger. You're distilling the richness of the ocean and enlivening it, and then that enlivened distillation of the ocean propels itself upstream against gravity. Sometimes they go well over 1,000 miles inland, where after laying eggs and creating the potential for a new generation, they die, and their carcasses feed dozens of kinds of animals, get dragged deep into the woods. The life cycle of the salmon is actually the transformation of the ocean into living beings that come ashore and become the biggest trees in the world.
Wild salmon represent something that is really important to us as human beings. You have Native American cultures here that have evolved with the fish for 11,000 years. You have, families like mine that fish for salmon and eat salmon and think about salmon. And then I think because this is the age of human impact, that where there are wild salmon, I think it represents our faith in Mother Nature, that we allowed that to happen. I was born to fish. All of my earliest memories revolve around fish in some way or another. As a young adult, I built my whole calendar year around the Skykomish spring fishery for wild steelhead. And that really became my obsession. I thought of hatcheries as something that actually kind of helped us as fishermen, that there would be more fish in the river and we were allowed to kill the hatchery fish, so that meant a meal. I don't think I ever had 1 second where I thought about conservation at all. I thought about getting enough money for gas and pizza so that I could fish all the time. What I didn't realize was that we were really at the tail end of a long decline of wild fish. In late 2000, they announced that the 2001 season would not happen, that the state was going to close down that spring catch and release fishery because there were so few wild steelhead fish that even a low impact fishing season could wipe out the last of them. It was really like a gut punch. I mean, I had built this whole life around this fishery and now it's gone. So that was, in a lot of ways, a wake-up call. I started doing some research, started reading, started talking to people. Talked to biologists, talked to fish managers, talked to other fishermen, and I learned about the 4 H's: hydro, harvest, habitat, and hatcheries. This is sort of kind of the impacts on salmon and steelhead people talk about. And so I used that as a guideline, and I started thinking about the skycomish, and well, the habitat hadn't really changed over those 10 years. It was pretty good. There was no hydro, there's no dams. The harvest, as far as I could tell, had remained relatively constant, and yet we had this plummeting number of fish. And so the one constant that I found is that the hatchery had been operating for the entire duration of the decline of wild steelhead. I think that was what started kind of my focus on learning more about the role that hatcheries play in the decline of not just fishing opportunities, but of wild fish populations, period. When the dams came down on the Elwha, it was the largest river restoration in history. We spent more than $320 million to recover wild salmon. But instead of letting them recolonize the river naturally the way they've evolved to do for millions of years, we spent $17 million to build a brand new hatchery. So now we're operating not just one, but 2 hatcheries on a river that was restored for the benefit of wild salmon. And we missed this huge opportunity to allow the river to return to being truly wild.
Coho 9288, no mark, no tag.
Coho 7063, no mark, no tag.
This is a team of interns and staff. They're collecting our long-term data on salmon use of the Elwha nearshore. We then take these data, compare them over the decade that we've been recording the information, and look at the evolution of the Elwha nearshore as the dam removal progresses. As wild fish now recruit into this nearshore area, we see these large numbers of hatchery fish. Our concern is that the hatchery species may be challenging the wild species that are trying to recover. They are vulnerable to these hatchery fish, either through predation or physical displacement or competition for resources. The risk is that we're actually stunting the river's ability to restore because these fish that literally are the backbone can't restore because they're being pressured by these continued hatchery releases. I do think that humans by nature have an engineering aspect. They like things to be orderly, they like things to be predictable. So that's what hatcheries give people. The flip side of that is wild and wilding your watershed.
Chinook 152, 146.
Wilding does have great uncertainty to it. That's how wild works. Wild is scary, but it's a really important place in people's soul.
Did you guys see how we walked when we were walking up here? We were walking along the trees, so we can look back into these 2 reds here where we know fish spawn. The males are the easiest to see, usually. So if there's males on there, more than likely there's gonna be a female in there. And then we'll sit there and concentrate because the females are really hard to see. They're like transparent half the time. She's moving up, she's right straight between us. Yep.
You see the tail?
Yep, moving up.
So. Okay. She's digging.
Oh yeah, she's digging right there.
Try it.
It's going to be pretty deep. Typically, what we see in a female is about 4,500 eggs. Then we'll do the males now. We'll keep them separate, keep the milk separate from the eggs. And then after we're done, we check them for a coated wire tag. This is the part that has the coated wire tag embedded in the head, and that would have information on the fish.
I know some people are going to view this as being brutal and barbaric, but this is what it takes to collect our brood stock at the Elwha facility. It's a tool. We're a tool to help recover this stock. When we miss a female, we feel like we've failed the fish itself, because we know that those eggs aren't going to survive as well as they would at the hatchery. We brought the eggs in from the cooler, lay the buckets on the floor, and then divide the females for how many males we have, and put the milk in there, mix it, let it sit for 30 seconds, mix them again, and then let them sit for another 30 seconds. And we weigh down 13 pounds into a bucket, let it drain all the ovarian fluid and milk, put them in iodophor for an hour, and then we'll lay them down till they eye. That's effectively artificial spawning at a hatchery.
There's been a lot of effort over the last several decades cataloging all of the genetic variation in populations of salmon and their cousins trout. Salmon have developed an incredible amount of diversity that allows them to be particularly successful in the stream in which they were born.
A huge river system will have huge salmon. Some of them used to run up to 100 pounds in the biggest rivers that had the most challenging falls that they had to jump over. And then little coastal streams, they had mostly smaller ones, even though it was the same species, but they were genetically totally different. Even in one river, where you have one species of a certain size, you may have the fall run and the spring run of that species. And those fish are completely different. They don't interact or interbreed at all.
We've been stocking salmon since the time of Darwin. When we first discovered how to take eggs and take milk and combine them, hatch fish, put them back into fresh water, we literally knew nothing of evolutionary ecology. We would have been flying blind. We now know that taking wild fish and exposing them to a hatchery environment, breeding them, hatching them, rearing them, for any amount of time really, changes the genetic makeup.
Fish are very complex critters that have evolved in Mother Nature over thousands of years, and there's things that happen at hatcheries that don't put them through those pressures that they face out in Mother Nature that makes them so they're a fit fish. What happens is you create a genetically inferior fish at the hatchery through all the domestication, and then those fish go spawn with fish in the wild, and that actually can degrade the genetics of the fish in the wild, so they're not as fit either.
What we do with Fish hatcheries is the same thing as growing a chicken. Economically, it makes more sense to put a bazillion chickens in one place, and it produces a really inferior chicken. And, you know, if nature can produce X number of fish in a river, let's dump more young fish in there. And it's absolutely wrong. It's not increasing our number of wild fish. It's eventually gonna extirpate all fish.
Life diversifies in order to survive, and humans do the opposite. We simplify in order to make things easier for ourselves. And by imposing simplification on a world that has taken millions of years to so wondrously diversify is a violent act on life itself.
Well, the fish toss is that we take the fish that return to the hatchery. So these are all the fish that were raised in the hatchery. We have this tote of fish, and I think there's probably a couple hundred fish in each tote, and they get frozen to a solid block, and we just drop them down and break them up and refreeze them so they don't stick together no more, and prep them for all the school groups.
Good morning to Sheila and Emily. Good morning. We talked about the 5 reasons why we're doing this a little bit ago. Does anybody remember? Can we get those? Yeah.
The trees.
The trees. What about the trees?
The trees need the nutrients.
The nutrients, right?
So we partner with the Nisqually Indian tribe who provides the carcasses from their hatchery program, which used to be considered a waste product. They're actually full of marine-derived nutrients because when they leave the river system, they're about yay big. When they come back, they're just carrying so much goodness from the ocean. So we teach this concept to the students. The Chinook and steelhead in this watershed are threatened species, so we inspire them to take action by getting these carcasses back into the upper watershed, which is actually very nutrient poor.
Should I get something? This is cool.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
What about this?
I don't like this.
A big one or a little one? The tails.
Just got this one.
Okay, well let me put the tail
little one.
separate, okay?
No. Salmon, I think they are very important for the ecosystem. Many animals eat them. Well, 138 vertebrate animals eat the salmon, specifically. I like the salmon tossing idea. I think it's a good help. But at the same time, I don't think it's the best idea. The ecosystem runs a specific way for a specific reason. We can try and help them by reducing pollution, but I don't think we should directly interact with the salmon wildlife and all that wildlife and let them run by themselves and make their own adaptations.
The conversation is, are there any wild salmon left? Show me a wild salmon. Show me, an abundant number coming back of wild salmon. And we just don't see it here in the Nisqually. As much as I'd rather have wild salmon, our hatchery salmon are important to us continuing our culture and our traditions. For us, this is our church. This is our medicine here, being on this river. And I think people have a hard time understanding that. because this is what our ancestors did since the beginning of time. You know, they fished, they hunted, they gathered, they protected what we have, and that's how we lived. And now we're in 2018, our salmon are depleting.
These are the raceways I was telling you about. 300,000 in each one. Yeah, 10. That's a lot of fish. He's going right now pulling all the dead ones out.
We're managers as Native American people. That's what we do, and we manage. But we also have to adapt to the times.
People have a tendency to get enamored with what they wish was instead of what is. There's a certain segment of the people of this area that want to blame hatchery fish for the decline of wild fish. The biggest problem is too many people, and salmon and humans don't coexist real well. We're going to build our houses along the rivers you need. We're going to build our towns in the estuaries you need. We're going to log the forests you need. We're going to take our drinking water out of the river you need. We made that deal a long time ago. We made the compromise already. And by saying that you don't need hatcheries to provide some sort of fishable abundance, you're saying you're going back on that deal. There's a lot of runs in the Northwest right now that if it wasn't for hatchery fish, they'd be extinct because they're progeny of hatchery fish. Where those fish have blinked out, they use hatchery fish to bring them back. I would like to see us make hatchery fish as much like wild fish as possible. I'd like to see us make them do as little harm to wild fish as possible. And I'd like to replace habitat, replace culverts, do everything you can to reduce the human footprint on salmon habitat and make sure that hatchery and wild fish both are here forever. It kind of offends me when people say that I don't care about their habitat or I don't care about conserving them. Hunters and fishermen and sportsmen have always been at the front of conservation and habitat reforms. If there's a problem, we notice it, and we like to address it, not just whine about it. The reason that I am involved in conservation efforts when I was younger is because I was hoping I'd see a result. But as I get older, I'm starting to think that's less and less likely because, again, we don't seem to, as a society, be willing to address the real issues. Nature's gone. You're viewing this through some Disneyland idea that we can still do all this bad stuff and recover salmon. Nope.
The southern resident killer whale population that I've been studying for 42 years began a serious decline around 1995. It was almost 100 whales. We're down to 74 right now. Salmon and orcas are just predator prey. They're like that. If you have a decline in the food, you have a decline in the whales. Most of those fish right now are hatchery produced, and they're getting smaller and smaller every year. They average 22 pounds, and now they're averaging 8 and 10 pounds. And the wild runs are being exterminated by the hatchery production. And the whales will follow the wild fish to extinction. The icon of the Northwest is starving.
A mother orca whose calf died after birth is still carrying her baby 17 days later. Researchers say that they're now concerned for the mother's health.
We had this whale coming in, had a brand new baby. One of our colleagues saw it, took a picture of her, and by the time our boat got there 30 minutes later, she was dead. And the mother started pushing the dead calf around. Okay, toward her. Go ahead.
Stand baby in mouth. Yes.
Yeah. See if she does it again. Well, she pushed this dead baby for 17 days. You know, it was a tour of grief that went on and on and on.
We want to welcome you to our last task force meeting for this year.
Governor Inslee convened this task force to save the southern resident killer whales. The easy fix that our own Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife says, oh, well, we'll just increase hatchery production by 50 million fish. Well, wait a minute. Why don't you look at what's happened with hatchery production and see that it's not working? And you want to do more of what doesn't work? Nobody wanted to hear stop fishing. That was almost untouchable. It wasn't about whale or fish requirements. It was all about commerce. Everybody wants to save the whales. Nobody wants to change our own way of life. It's a very difficult choice for our society to look at what we're doing, what we have done over the years in terms of fisheries management, and change the paradigm. I didn't realize until about a month had passed how depressed I was. I'm seeing all this before my very eyes and documenting it. And that's the part that is troubling to me, is that I'm going to be in charge of keeping track of the extinction of these animals. But if it's a lesson to our society that, hey, we got to change, maybe that's what I have to do. We're going to die of a loneliness of spirit with all the creatures gone.
Every year, Idaho Power partners with other biologists to raise and release 6.8 million Chinook and steelhead. The next generation of fish needs next generation ideas. Our innovative approach maintains abundant fish populations, giving anglers a chance to land brag-worthy steelhead. Fish on.
Hatcheries are pawns in a game of political power. The whole thing is about money. Fishing is a huge industry, and every state is competing with each other for those dollars. It's not about conserving our resources. It's perverting our resources on a short-term bet to get tourist dollars in. In fact, federal dollars to support fish and wildlife agencies is based on how many license sales there are in each of those states. The internal finances is that it provides power and wealth to the agencies themselves. To build a new hatchery, it's millions and millions of dollars of high, extensive, automated piping and flow systems, so you have lots of temperature control on lots of different fish rearing stations so that you can raise different species up to different sizes and maximize production.
So we've got the water costs, electrical costs, building maintenance costs, and just the feeding costs of the fish. So we're looking at plus or minus $20 million in assorted costs throughout a year. It's a major business, and there's portions of that business that 20 plus employees are doing year round.
Hatcheries are a perfect example of political pork. They spread their hatcheries around their state. They're in almost every county of the state. They target them on key members of the state Senate and the state legislature. As a result, they buy the support of that local person.
These hatcheries are a subsidy to commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen, and it's being paid for by all the taxpayers.
I think one of the main reasons why it's important that people understand what's going on is just purely the waste of their money that's happening. In Washington state alone, there are 174 hatcheries producing more than 190 million salmon every year. On the West Coast, over 90% of the quote-unquote wild-caught salmon you find in markets actually came from hatcheries. Between California, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, citizens pay for the release of almost 280 million fish per year. Last year, between the United States, Canada, Russia, Korea, and Japan, 5 billion salmon were released into the North Pacific.
When I wrote my first book, the Bonneville Power Administration was spending about $140 or $150 million on their program. Since 1982, they've spent $15 billion. The General Accounting Office did a survey, and they showed that hatcheries consumed 40% of that.
The big question is, who pays for the raising of the fish and who gets the benefits? Fish that go out of the Columbia River circle around Alaska, some fish even as far as Russia. Your survival rate goes down to 0.001 or so. Some of those fish, we figured, cost over $1,000.
The Eniat hatchery on the Upper Columbia was producing spring Chinook salmon that were costing $68,031 per harvested fish. State and federal agencies plant more than 100 million rainbow trout in waters across the United States every year. In some of our most protected wilderness areas, places high in the mountains where you're not even allowed to ride a mountain bike or pick a wildflower, taxpayers spend money every year to drop millions of non-native fish by airplane or helicopter just so visitors have something to catch. Billions of dollars of citizen public money is spent to support something that clearly does not work. We're on a path to where there eventually will be no fish, and we will have spent billions of dollars to get to that point.
The ironic thing is that fish know how to do all of this. They know how to live in those environments. They know how to reproduce. So if we allow fish to get back to being fish and doing what they do in those environments, in pulling back some of our infrastructure, restoring streams, we reap the benefits free of charge.
The concept in the earliest days of settlement in the West was that it was a God-given right to take from it what we could. Times change, needs change, understanding of our place in the universe changes, and the world's becoming a smaller and more crowded place. But this understanding that we have to take care of the land, that it's not infinite, it won't continue to produce and provide for us unless we look at it and manage it responsibly. That is a relatively new concept. Managing our water resources is important in our agricultural pursuits, but also this water has tremendous values to this fishery. And this fishery is one of the great fisheries in the world, and our local economy is based on that. So for us to succeed, we need our community and our river systems to be as healthy as possible. Going back a ways, this is really the place in Montana where the concept of a wild fishery started. There were hatchery-raised fish that were put in here based on the idea that the more fish we had in the river, the more fish would be caught by fishermen, the better our economy would be. Then lo and behold, they discovered something very surprising.
We're doing estimates now in the Madison, and we're seeing a lot of young brown trout in the lower river, but the next year they would be gone. One of the first things I kept seeing is we stocked the best waters. The waters that had the best fisheries were the ones where we were putting catchables. I proposed a study. Leave Norris alone, don't stock it. We'll take Varney, not stock it, and take Odell Creek, which has never been stocked. Let's stock it and see what happens. The first year that we didn't stock Varney, the upper river, the population of brown trout doubled. And of course, when we stocked Odell Creek, the population halved. We didn't know we were doing damage. We figured, well, there's 2 out there and we put 2 more in. We've got 4 fish now, and that's better than 2 fish. Well, that's not the math that works in reality. Once that information became available through the Madison Odell studies, that maybe our dollars were being lousily spent. In fact, we were destroying what we're trying to protect. Well, they said any waters that had self-sustaining trout populations could not be stocked, period. And it came policy.
Shortly after that program was initiated, you saw the population of this river just skyrocket with wild fish. We started our fly shop in 1979, a few years after the hatchery program was absolved on the Madison River. And we were fortunate to catch that wave of a wild trout fishery. We saw an increase in the number of anglers that came to Montana, came to the Yellowstone area, and specifically southwest Montana, to experience those wild fisheries. And that's what really kicked in the fly fishing businesses at that time. People are more attuned to a healthy river because they see what's happened here. They see the whole cascade of everything that benefits because of a wild trout fishery, including a local economy.
The one thing that came out of this to me is the change in behavior of the humans when they saw that they weren't becoming given fish, that they become more vigilant. And habitat becomes more important when they realize that's how they get their fish.
As most of you already know, we had a major eruption occurring at 8:32 approximately this morning on Mount St. Helens. It does appear that the northwest flank of the mountain seems to be gone.
When Mount St. Helens erupted in 1981, it was a massive explosion. It tore off about 1/3 the top of the mountain. Most of that effluent went down the Toutle River Basin.
Look at this, it doesn't even look like the same country. I can't believe I've camped up in this area. It doesn't look like any place I've ever been before.
The consequences at the river were startling. The upper canyon of Toutle was totally devegetated. There were chasms of volcanic effluent. Anything living in the stream was virtually destroyed. It brought back a sense of hopelessness. At that point, there was the feeling that evolution and recolonization of rivers may take tens of thousands of years. As a result, that meant that no more hatchery fish were put into it. What became evident in the Toutle River system is that the steelhead in particular came back above what they were prior to the eruption 5 years later. By 7 years later, they more than doubled. So those first years of the Toutle River were a prime example of what wild fish can actually do in the most absolute adverse conditions if they are not constrained by having to intermix with hatchery populations. Unfortunately, as the Toutle River began to show that it can produce fish, back we went to the hatchery programs again. Hatchery numbers went up, wild fish went down. Same old story. Loss of faith in nature is the problem. Nature knows how to make fish work. the best thing that we as human beings can do, and that the salmon and steelhead ask of us, just get out of our way.
Salmon famously have to fight their way upstream to spawn, but thanks to hydroelectric dams, that's become increasingly difficult. But don't worry, because as we found out recently, America is on it.
I'm Ben Tracy in Washington State, where we're going to introduce you to a pretty sweet piece of technology known as the salmon cannon.
In your darkest moments of despair, when you see a world torn apart by war, I want you to remember that video and think, we can do great things. We can do great things.
Humans believe we can do anything and everything all the time. And that can-do spirit has gotten us far and made a lot of changes in the world. Certainly made a lot of us able to continue living at gigantic population densities. But it has its limits, and we don't understand anything about those limits. An example of a good myth is Icarus. Icarus was a tinkerer, and he wanted to free himself from the bounds of Earth and gravity. He wanted to fly. So he made wings. He made wings of wax, and he flew. Because he didn't sense any limits, he flew too close to the sun. The sun melted his wings, and he came crashing down to Earth. So the greater truth in that is beware of hubris, exercise some humility, and be careful when you're tinkering.
I'm 55 years old now. I've been living with my salmon fishing all my life. I try to follow my heart. I mean, I'm not rich in money, but I've had 6,000 days on salmon rivers all around the world, which makes me rich in a different way. The salmon fishing in Norway is central to all the small towns that are located on a river, and in the old days, the salmon used to be the thing that was feeding the people. It's special to Norway. Now it's also special in the other way, because the second biggest industry is this fish farming thing that is now, it's threatening to kill what's the original fish. We were so stupid. I was so stupid, because when they started fish farming, I thought, oh hey, this is the solution to everything. We farm the fish and they don't have to kill our wild fish. They don't have to kill the fish I want to fish for, and the stocks will go up and all will be fantastic. In very short time, we learned that the sealers were killing the wild smolt leaving the river. Fewer fish were coming up. You know, they say that one of these farms out here, they produce as much shit than the whole town of Oslo, and they just leave it in the fjord. When it's polluted enough, you move to another location, and you can pollute another place. Then there are more fish escaping from Norwegian fish farms than all the Norwegian wild salmon rivers produce. And they mix with the wild stock, and they destroy the unique DNA of the fish. Alta's got the biggest Atlantic salmon in the world. There are more 50-pounders caught here than anywhere else. There's quite a big difference on the river that I see today. The DNA on the Alta salmon is not like it was before.
I see no difference between a fish farm and a hatchery fish because of gene pollution. You get escapees from these fish farms. Sometimes millions of fish escape. And then they breed with wild fish, dumbing down the genes. We're reversing natural selection. We're devolving these fish.
I really always wanted to see one of these farms. We got into our wetsuits, then we jumped into the sea, and we sneaked up to one of these farms. I knew I was going to see a lot of fish, but I didn't think it was going to be that bad. It was so full of sick fish. They had fungus, they looked like S's. They were wounds big as my hand.
Nobody should eat this. You show this to the moms that want to feed their kids with this. They will never buy one of these fish.
It was like if you should walk into a farm where you have cows that would have big wounds, bleeding and lying down, barely breathing. Who would eat that? No one. But these things are happening under the surface, you know? Nobody knows about this. The thing is, we lost one thing here, and we lost the respect for the ecosystem. We're the guys that should protect the rivers, protect them from all kinds of farms and hatcheries and all this. My responsibility is not to feed the people in the world, okay? If I have a responsibility, it is to say when I see things are wrong with what I like and what I love, and that's the rivers and salmon. Solution is there, and that is to get these into the closed tanks. If it will double the price of the salmon, it's worth it. What's the price of an ecosystem? What's it worth?
Scout is on one. What is your emergency?
My husband and I are on our boat in Secret Harbor, and the middle fish pen is breaking apart. It's huge, and the whole thing is buckling. There's a forklift that looks like it's about ready to go in the water. It's pretty dramatic to me.
Well, what just happened was that there was a catastrophic failure. One of the net pens off of Cypress Island completely imploded. The fish that escaped are Atlantic salmon. They're not Pacific salmon. We're talking 305,000 exotic species are now polluting Puget Sound. These fish are going to be entering into our rivers, competing with our wild fish in the spawning grounds, competing with them for food, bringing diseases and parasites and viruses to these wild fish, and it's a disaster.
When I heard that 300,000 Atlantic salmon escaped into the ocean environment, I immediately kind of dropped everything and knew that this was something that I needed to go and document, because I knew that no one else was getting the underwater side of things.
Diver in!
I didn't expect to see the level of destruction that I saw. The pens were totally split open and completely destroyed. There were holes all through them that the Atlantic salmon had escaped from, and there was a few fish left gasping, caught in the nets. But other than that, the fish were gone into the marine environment and clearly unaccounted for.
Galactic Ice, Galactic Ice, Galactic Ice. We ask that you remove your diver from the water immediately. This is classified as trespassing. We suggest you please halt these operations. Cypress Fish Farm, over and out.
It's an extremely charged scene. It seems like it's a big secret what's going on under there, and the last thing that these companies want is people to go under and actually see what's going on, because then these stories that they're telling the public, it's so easy to poke holes in them when you get footage of what's actually going on the farms.
The concept of an emergency response plan it's a bit humorous. It's basically tell the commercial fishers and the recreational fishers to go out and fish, because now we have more fish for you. It's like telling the people when the Exxon Valdez spilled, free oil, go collect it.
Out of the 66 fish that we caught, 50 of those were farmed Atlantic salmon. The teeth are a little bit more recessed, and then you notice the splotches on the face that are not at all present on a wild king. The tail is one of the biggest giveaways, and Atlantic salmon tends to be squared off, and the wild kings has a very sharp V. When we're making a set, we'll see a couple swim right to the surface, whereas you never see a wild stock do that. The wild have that instinct to run. Instinct to survive, I guess, and the Atlantics only know, I don't know, when it's feeding time.
Every single day, our public trust is being undermined by the pollution that these pens are putting into our sound. The viruses and parasites, pharmaceuticals that are going into our waters. The industrial model is to make as much money as you can, as quickly as you can, regardless of the environmental consequences. What we're seeing today, what we've seen over the last couple of days, are those environmental consequences coming home.
It turns out that Washington is the only West Coast state that allows open water net pen salmon farms. To me, it's really an outrage that this is even allowed. You know, I think anybody who's concerned with the state of the environment and our planet thinks about the future, and especially if you have children. You start to feel like, okay, what's the world going to be like for them? It feels really important to me that they participate in protecting their own future. We're so busy these days that to be unified on these things, whether it's fighting to make sure that there are salmon in the future or going out to catch fish, those become really precious times for a dad who's watching his kids grow up really fast. Thought we'd go out there with a few boats and wave some signs around and protest it. But it turned out that people from all walks of life that use the sound or enjoy living near the sound, a healthy sound, were also outraged. The Suquamish tribe was there to protest. There were commercial fishermen there. There was a whole fleet of kayaks. There was a lot of sport fishing boats. I mean, there was even a guy on a jet ski carrying a sign around. We spent the few days ahead of time making some signs to carry and laughed about sort of what we would say and what the slogans were. But underlying it all, I think the kids feel like they're able to participate in the things they care about. And I think we made our point because now here we are months later, and there's actually 3 pieces of legislation that are pending affecting net pens.
Wild salmon are threatened by these sorts of facilities. The day in, day out impacts to our magical, majestic Salish Sea cannot go unchecked. It is unconscionable that when we are spending tens and tens of millions of dollars to protect and recover wild salmon, we would allow an invasive species to be introduced to our ecosystem.
Mr. President, there are 35 yea, 12 nay, 2 excused.
Having received a constitutional majority, second substitute Senate Bill 6086 is declared passed. The title of the bill will be the title of the act.
Hey-oh, hey-oh, hello, hello, hey, hey, hey-oh, hey, hey-oh.
The Yurok belief is that we have been here since the beginning of time. At one point, this Earth was a lonely rock in the universe floating by itself, and it began to get sad, and its tears became the ocean, and it finally came to be what we have today. The Walgate, the spirit people, started creating this world. And one of the things they had done was made a relationship between us and the salmon. The salmon were put here so they could sustain us, and that we would always have a food source, and that way we would always live and we would always be prosperous. We also have a story of if we don't take care of this world and there are no more salmon, then there will be no more need for Yurok people.
The 2002 fish kill was really the canary in the coal mine. It was a low water year, but ag got their water. If you divert that much water and flows get so low on the Klamath, you will have some kind of major fish disease outbreak. And that's exactly what happened. 70,000 adult salmon died, all within the Klamath River. The dead fish were lining the banks, 3-4 layers deep, and it smelled like death. In a wild river, nothing like that happens, right? That is not a natural thing.
The future, if it goes unchanged, it is going to be the destruction of salmon species on the west coast of the United States. The tribe voted not to have a commercial salmon season this year because of the low projected numbers. And the subsistence amount was the lowest I think I've ever seen. Tribal members used to live almost solely on returning fish runs, and now, this year, we get less than 1 fish per person. How can you possibly look at that and not realize that there is a gigantic problem here? These reductions of the salmon runs, the big picture is they're affecting our health. We know those omega oils, those omega-3s and 6s in salmon are very heart healthy. That's why we have a lot of elders that live to ripe old ages. But the point is that what's going to happen down the road? What's going to happen to our people?
When your society, when your culture, when your belief is connected directly to the world around you, when you're raised with a sense that you are a part of everything in your surroundings and your natural environment, it does something to your community's psychology and mindset when you start to see that world crumble and break. As the decline of the salmon runs come back, you can see a direct correlation with the decline of us as a people.
It's just a disruption of the whole sort of cycle of the tribe and what we do as a people, because that fishing isn't there. And I think when that happens, then all of us feel pain. It's like we grieve for that. A lot of times when you're grieving or when you're, hurting over something, you turn to drug and alcohol. And so we're seeing spikes in drug and alcohol rates. There's an opioid crisis on the reservation right now. There's a suicide crisis on the reservation right now. All of these things are connected in part because when you take away the river, you take away the fishery, you take away that core component of who we are as a people, and then it kind of falls apart and people start getting in trouble. that's where we are now. And that's why you have all those other sort of issues arising in our community.
Let's go, boy!
The traditional game of sticks, it's actually one of the few pieces of Yurok culture that never went away. You have a stick and you have a tossel. Take the tossel and make it go through the goal. And you do that any way you can. Today we play of no hitting with a stick, no stabbing, no eye gouging, and no choking. Other than that, everything is game and everything is fair to play. If you can take it and you can give it out a little bit, you get to play. It teaches those lessons in life that's important to Yurok to be tough, to be respectful, and to fight regardless of what the size difference is. I think it lends a lot to why when we get into conflicts or when we get into fights like the dam, we don't care who the biggest, richest man in the world is, who owns it, because we'll play up every day of the week. We don't care.
We all kind of came back together and decided that this was when we were going to fight. The FERC license for the dams expired. There was this opportunity to pursue dam removal, and so that's where the fight went.
Federal, state, and local lawmakers has come up with a way to do what Congress could not. Get the water and the fish in the Klamath River flowing freely again.
We're starting to get it right after so many years of getting it wrong.
This is the crown jewel of salmon country. This is it right here. The people want it to be wild. They want it to be what it was before the dams, before colonization, before agriculture. The work that the tribe is doing is to redirect the energy to a place where we're focusing on that comprehensive restoration to get the wild runs back, as opposed to agreeing to some kind of short-lived political compromise like the hatchery ideas that really just put Band-Aids on, gaping wounds. The approach is we're here forever and we want those wild salmon to be here forever, and that's what we're planning for and that's what we're working on. Having a wild river, having the wild salmon, it puts the community back together and it gives them purpose. And it allows us to fulfill that initial promise that we made to the Creator, right? About taking care of this river and living in a balance with us. And when you do that as a people, you feel good. That's like the ultimate self-determination, that's the ultimate sovereignty, is to be able to live in a way that is consistent with your own cultural values. And that's what we're fighting for.
You could say that everything we learn from the stories that we are given. You could also then say that all the problems we have are symptoms of stories that were wrong. Stories we told ourselves and stories we passed on where we misunderstood things deeply.
If hatcheries were successful and were addressing the situation, we wouldn't be having this discussion today. The underlying causes of the problems are still there, and after all these years, we're still having to put fish out there every year to keep them going. Perhaps it's time to pull back and question, is this the right path forward? How far do we go to manufacture wildness before we realize what we're really doing and think about alternative approaches like protecting and restoring wild things?
There's no right way to do the wrong thing. The right thing is to work on our rivers that we've destroyed and turned into sewers and dammed up, and fix that so that we have wild fish. This little issue is just a reflection of what we're doing to the whole planet. It's more than just our relationship with fish. It's how we're trying to control nature rather than work with nature. A life without wild nature, a life without these great iconic species is an impoverished life. If we lose all wild species, we're going to lose ourselves.
Hello, everyone. I hope you found that film as powerful and moving as I did. there's many bits in there, but one of my favorite quotes is I can't remember his name, but he says, "Life diversifies itself in order to survive, and humans do the opposite. We simplify to make things easier for ourselves, and by imposing simplification on a world that has taken millions of years to so wondrously diversify is a violent act on life itself." And I think there is a lot within that comment which can relate to many of the challenges that we're seeing in the world today. This obsession with trying to simplify instead of embracing complexity and kind of revering and honoring that complexity and understanding humans' intelligence. We are intelligent, but cannot meet nature's complexity, and we need to realize we're not in control. So there's so much within that film that I think is so powerful, and I hope you enjoyed it. Please keep writing in your comments and your questions. Where are the other panelists? We've got a brilliant host of panelists. There they are. Hi everyone. So everyone, I'm joined today by the director and producer of Artificial, Josh Murphy, Paul Wilson, a photographer, the chief storyteller for Rios to Rivers and a Klamath Tribes member, Leanne Fode from Drinkable Rivers, Leah Doriel, Oceanic Global founder and director, and Matt Mellon from Eco Hustler and a big campaigner against salmon farms in Scotland. So welcome everyone. And instead of me reading out your bios, I would love to invite each of you to take a minute to introduce yourselves and your work and passion in regards to rivers, waters, wildlife, and igniting cultural change. So I'd love to know a bit about your work and what sustains the incredible work that you're involved in. I might start with inviting Josh to share.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having us in such an important area of discussions. I think so many people are so dedicated to oceans, of which I am one, but so few people recognize the impact rivers play and freshwater systems play on humanity. So I'm really glad that we have the chance to kind of pick up that and really kind of dive deeper. I am a filmmaker. I was a fisheries biologist turned filmmaker. I have a master's degree in fisheries biology. Oddly enough, I worked on a land-based salmon farm, or I should say fish farm in Ireland. It was a trout farm. And I managed the on-campus hatchery at Humboldt State University, where I earned my master's degree. And at the time, didn't quite understand the implications. And it wasn't taught at the undergraduate level or the graduate level, the power of wild. And only through diving back into this film did I all of a sudden have this much deeper understanding. And the film was kind of an amazing opportunity for me to fulfill a life's dream, because when I was growing up, Jacques Cousteau was my hero, my idol. And I went into fisheries because I thought of Cousteau as a scientist and somebody who was kind of studying the natural world. But of course, what I didn't realize at the time was he's really a filmmaker. The way we all know Cousteau is interacting with his films. And that's what kind of in part led me into applying my background in science into film. And I had been working on a whole bunch of different types of films. I was a co-producer of a film called The River Why, if you've ever read the book by David James Duncan, which we made into a kind of a Hollywood feature film. The book is still better, even though I like the film. And it kind of reinvigorated my love of discussing river. I was a competitive whitewater kayaker as well for quite some time. So my relationship with the river was always very tactile, I would say. But many years later, I was making a piece for 1% for the Planet, of which Yvonne Chouinard, founder of Patagonia, also founded, where we businesses give back 1% of their gross to help issues around environment. As Yvonne likes to say, there's no such thing as good business on a dead planet. So in making this piece for Yvonne, over lunch, somebody happened to say, we're in the Montana wilderness. Well, I guess we were just out of the wilderness, but we were sitting on the back of a pickup truck, and somebody said to Yvonne, "What's the next film you're working on?" And he paused for a second and said, "Yeah, well, it's a film about the arrogance of man." And I remember thinking, oh, this is funny. Where would this go? Because it's a huge topic. And he said it's about how we're kind of unwilding salmon and trout and really about the whole world about how we've given up on wild. And I was like, I can't believe you just said that. And so I explained to him this whole background I have over lunch, chewing on a sandwich on the back of a pickup truck. And at the end of the day, he came up and said, hey, do you have a card? And I didn't. So I just scribbled my information on a piece of paper. He said, I got something I want to talk to you about. I'll call you. And I thought, that's not how it works. This is not how it works. Well, with him, that is how it works. And 2 days later, his producer called and said, Yvonne would like to know if you'd be interested in making a movie about fish farms and hatcheries. And I was like, absolutely, but what is it? And they said, well, that's for you to find out. And so that was the beginning of a 3-year journey that kind of allowed me to go full circle, right back to that place that as a kid, I always wanted to be. And I remember at the end of it thinking, I can't believe this happened. And that we have the opportunity, I should say, to have these conversations now about such a pressing topic, because this topic extends well beyond the ocean and well beyond the rivers. It's about really the future of making room for wild in our world. And I think when seen in that light, the film becomes much more resonant for people who may not necessarily care about hatchery or a fish farm, but understand the implications for wild.
Fascinating. Thank you, Josh. It's so amazing to hear the stories behind these great pieces of work and how many different threads intersect in order for that perfect moment to happen, in order for that film to have occurred. So really, really amazing to hear that story. I'd like to pass on to Matt, who I know was impacted by this film a few years ago. So Matt, it'd be great to hear from you about what's kind of ignited your passion for all these important issues we're discussing.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, Christabel, and hi everyone. Josh, thank you. It was seeing this film 3 years ago that started our salmon campaign. City to Sea, a Bristol charity, put the film on, and a group of us saw it. We were so affected, and it's exactly what you're saying, that it just really shows how badly humans are messing with nature. And I mean, Christopher, you said a line that stuck with you. A line that really stuck with me was just early on in the film when the lady's saying that, are we going to let salmon go extinct on our watch? And I feel like Scotland is a period behind where North America is in terms of what's happening to salmon, but we're going in the same direction. And it's really important that we learn those lessons and do what we can over here. In the UK, in supermarkets, all the salmon products are labelled responsibly sourced, which is completely infuriating, because as soon as you find anything out about salmon farming, there's literally nothing responsible about it at all. It's all really, really bad news and terrible things that are happening. And so we set up a petition calling on supermarkets to drop that. And we were amazed. We had over 100,000 signatures. It really resonates with people. People don't want to be missold food products, and it's and all that marketing is based on a lie. And we're trying to up the ante now. We're going into supermarkets and we've got stickers that are bright yellow and say, warning, this product causes environmental damage. We're actually putting them in salmon products. But I think we've got to do more, really, because at the rate we're going, salmon is going to go extinct on our watch.
Brilliant. Thank you, Matt. And Leanne, over to you. What ignites and sustains your passion with the brilliant project Drinkable Rivers?
Thank you for this movie. It touches so deeply on what it means to be alive. And what ignites me is the love for life. And so I dream of a world with drinkable rivers, and raising awareness for that and putting people into actions is what we do with drinkable rivers. And so if this rewilding so belongs together with these drinkable rivers, if we can drink again from our rivers, it will mean that all our relationships on the land are healthy and in balance and contribute to it. And that's what I do also with Source to Sea river walks. Citizen Science was part of the film too. So it was so good to see that what we also do, monitoring the health of our river systems and engaging everyone, that everyone in the watershed matters. And it's also the ambition of what it takes. And so if we have drinkable rivers again, it will mean a big bow to the salmon. And so this is, I think, the biggest we could give make every step in our actions towards a drinkable river. And so that's what we can ask ourselves. Does this action help to a world with drinkable rivers, with swimmable rivers, with full of salmon and flowable rivers, or not?
Fabulous. Thank you, Leanne. And over to you, Paul.
Well, Clisad Galasas is Hiswak Skinna, Nodakni, Choyuksikni. Hey, y'all, my name is Paul Robert Wolf Wilson. I'm a citizen of the Klamath and Modoc Nations of Southern Oregon and Northern California. My families and my peoples are from the headwaters of the Upper Klamath Basin. And my family, I come from fishers and hunters. I'm a visual storyteller. My works focus on the connections between peoples, the lands and waters they steward, and the cultures that tie them together. Professionally, I'm the chief storyteller at Rios Rivers. I'm the co-director of the Mucklucks Paddle Club, an advisory board member of Water Climate Trust, and a lead ambassador for Northwest River Suppliers. So I didn't know you were a kayaker, Josh, but that's awesome to hear. Rios Rivers has a partnership with International Rivers through the Rivers for Climate Coalition. And so our coalition was actually in Scotland in November, asking and demanding that the UN stop recognizing dams as clean energy. So thoughts are with you there, Matt.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. And last but not least, Leah.
Thank you all. Such a touching and profound film. I'm the founder of an ocean nonprofit called Oceanic Global, and we really look at shedding light on humanity's essential relationship to the ocean and empowering all levels of change. So this really resonated from working with individuals, communities, industries, and policy. I'm personally really passionate about the interconnectedness of all life on Earth and the dynamics needed with rebalancing our relationship with the natural world. So excited for this discussion.
Wonderful. And I might just jump back to you, Leah, because what I was thinking about when I was watching the film was about this tension that kind of happens across environmental crises, where there's a tension between addressing a global environmental challenge, but whilst also respecting and preserving local livelihoods. And I was just interested to hear from your perspective of running this global ocean NGO, what you've learned over the years. And I know you did that brilliant event last year with the UN, which was looking at oceans and livelihoods. So yeah, what have you learned recently in regards to balancing global action, policy making with protecting local livelihoods? Because from that film, you see how many people's lives are fully invested in this. And it's not necessarily, it wasn't necessarily their decision for it to be in this way, but to remove that completely would be removing a whole structure of support underneath them.
Yeah, so when we did last year's event, which for the UN for World Oceans Day, which was the ocean life and livelihoods, I think one of the main takeaways was really this idea of needing to coexist and really looking at finding ways to rebalance our relationship with nature. And key to that is protecting local livelihoods. Those who are really directly reliant on these natural ecosystems. I think right now we're in a place where everyone is really excited about, the latest technologies, etc. But we really need to remember and really put key to all of this, the need to incorporate ancient wisdom, traditional practice, making a localized approach to these issues we face. So I think when looking at, forming these global policies, which you touched upon, really working with local communities to do so needs to be a central pillar. Local communities are the ones that really understand fishing quotas and what it takes to, for these areas to rebound and have these long-term invested interests within these ecosystems. And, when we look at things like marine protected areas in the ocean space, the most successful ones are when local communities are part of creating those and are part of those management structures versus it being excluded from it. So that would be the biggest takeaway, is making sure that all levels of stakeholders are a part of this. And I think that's really when you only truly get a long-term sustainable framework. I don't love the word sustainable because we need to be moving towards regeneration, but super, super important for this, for coexistence to really happen.
Brilliant, thank you. I think, yeah, maintaining it always in your mind that local communities are best placed to know what the local ecosystems of which they're a fundamental part need, rather than others who are generally invested in the profits of that local community or that local ecosystem, rather to displace that and to put in the center. Because I think that it's easy to look around the world and think that humans, you know, there's that narrative of humans are the virus, but it's not. It's global systems and economic systems. And I think what was so, like, not shocking, far from shocking, and frustratingly not shocking, was seeing that the economic drivers behind and the political drivers behind these hatcheries and fish farms. I wanted to direct that question also to Paul and to Josh. What has been, like, what's the direct experience you've had with local communities and these fish farms? There must be a lot of tension in the local areas. It'd be great to know what your experience of that was, and if you found any solutions and ways to kind of create a respectable approach.
I'll default to you, Josh.
Oh, you unmute, Josh.
Better? Right now I'm making a short film about a company called America Aqua Farms, which has proposed the largest open water salmon production in the United States. Part of it's the largest in North America, really, which is off of the coast of Maine in a place called Frenchman Bay, which is in the viewshed of the national park, Acadia National Park. And the community is absolutely opposed to this. But because of the relaxed laws in Maine for management of their coast, they have to allow the company to move through the process of submitting for permits. It's so big that this one farm could supply each of the 300 plus million people in the United States with 6 ounces of salmon a year. And so it's fully for a profit of a Norwegian company using the waters of Maine to get what they want, because they couldn't make this in Norway because Norway's regulations are stricter. So they're shopping out where the regulations are the most relaxed. And it brings us back to kind of this idea that local communities have power, but ultimately the most power they have is at the systemic level, when they can help the people that could approve such things get into office or not get into office. Because we realize that we have power, but if we don't have vote, at least within democracies like parts of the world, other parts of the world, it's not a democracy. So it's a different type of power. But once those powers can be vested in the people by representatives who actually can look out for them, then maybe we can change something. Because this community is absolutely opposed, but yet it continues and it's moving forward through the process. And this would happen were it not for the voice of the community, but really those are putting pressure on those people that could approve such things. So, and this is the same thing I'm sure that's happening in Scotland. We're seeing it happen in Chile. We're seeing it happen in all of these different places where people are saying, how can we, at the expense of somebody else's environment, make our profit? The externalities, the costs that are not associated with the actual cost of buying, or price, I should say, of buying salmon are very rarely calculated. The cost to the environment, where people are losing native fish, losing ecosystems that has supported people for so long, those costs aren't factored in. You're just paying $17 a pound. And that's the infrastructure cost in the place of the corporation. But I think we have to look more globally at what these costs are, because at that level, salmon is very expensive. Farm salmon is extraordinarily expensive. And to Matt's point earlier, this whole idea of labeling salmon as sustainable, we oddly enough in the United States, and it may be this case in all parts of the world, but we haven't even been able to find out what a legal definition of wild is. There is no such thing as a legal definition of wild that I'm aware of. So you can't even call a fish wild in this case, because we don't have a term wild that's legally defined. We have more protections over tomatoes, which are organic or non-organic, than we do with fish, what is wild and what is hatchery and what is farmed. And so it's really important that we try to kind of bring light to the fact that people, consumers, need to understand what they're buying, the implications of that, and really put the pressure on those people that can actually inform. But industry would prefer you not have that information, so it's not always available. So good on you, Matt, for pushing to get labeling, because it's very important. So most of, in the United States, for example, Alaska salmon, people say wild Alaskan salmon. Alaska has the largest hatchery program in the United States, 1.8 billion fish released a year. In fact, 3% of all of the tax on landings go to support that hatchery system, simply because they want to make more money at the expense of wild. But then we've seen in Bristol Bay, which is far north Alaska, above the Alaskan Peninsula, which is the one that kind of swings way out towards Russia. That's Bristol Bay area, all wild, and had the biggest return of sockeye salmon since the mid-1800s just last year, all wild. So we have to kind of go back to say, what ecosystem services can wild provide? Huge for humanity, but also huge for these ecosystems that rely on these things. And so I hope that we have a much broader kind of understanding of what those localized impacts are in context of the wider story.
Totally. Thank you, Josh. Paul, I'd love to go to you, but like kind of building on what we've just been sharing, but I'd love to ask you in particular what, you're kind of chief storyteller, and what you see as the role of storytelling in uniting people and accessing power and igniting social movements and igniting people power. Why is storytelling so important, and what role does that play in systemic change?
Yeah, so my people here in the Upper Klamath Basin have oral traditions documenting histories far beyond 8,000 years within this basin. It's a considerable feat that these methods of storytelling have survived the genocidal attempts of erasure by the United States. And the means of producing a moving picture like the one we just witnessed through Josh and through Yvonne, haven't the accessibility of producing that haven't been accessible to communities like mine. Too often stories about us are made without us, or without us in meaningful and decision-making capacities. And so one of the things at Rios to Rivers that I really work on is something called visual sovereignty. And that's returning and reintroducing the authority and the means of telling stories from these localized communities, from Indigenous communities, to foster that stewardship. Our mission at Rios Rivers is to inspire and empower the next generation of river stewards. And we do that through river running exchange programs, source to sea, like Leanne was saying. And we invite youth from rivers that are either impacted or endangered by hydroelectric dams. And so that's Chile, Bolivia, Argentina, Peru, Myanmar, and sharing the story from the Klamath River. I've used this platform to share the story of a 100-year war that my people's Amy Cordalis, I really wish she was able to make it. Our peoples along the Klamath River have won this 100-year war against the biggest billionaires in the world. And to tell that story to these grassroots Indigenous youth that are activists in all of these communities, and we're not activists, we're stewards. It's built into our cultural identities. And so though these campaigns and these they come and go, a part of our cultural identity, our natural contract with the places that we steward as Indigenous peoples, it's built into that. And so making sure that giving Indigenous youth that are facing these colonial attempts of theft and destruction today, the lessons we've learned from the tactics and strategies used here, is how I've found to build solidarity really effectively. One of the things I'll leave as an actionable item is we have a petition at undam.org, and it's asking the UN to stop recognizing dams as clean energy. And right now, dams are being built in a lot of the places that Josh and I were mentioning, under the guise of being clean, being green, because the United Nations and a lot of governing bodies don't recognize the methane emissions that the reservoirs behind these rivers are leaving, and they're actually 80 times worse at times than traditional coal burning plants. And so indigenous youth all around the world and indigenous peoples, governments, and nations are fighting the development of dams as we're greenwashing the renewable energy sector. And so again, undam.org, go sign that. And yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul. It's something that I think, there's the link, undam.org. This is happening all the time. We're seeing supposed solutions to the climate and ecological crisis supposed solutions coming forward, when really all they're doing is just deepening us into these trenches of destruction, of ecological destruction. And it's like these companies have got their stories, they've nailed the stories, and they're being pummeled out. And I think there's a lot of confusion out there as to what to think, because people think dam, they think renewable energy. But again, going back to the quote that I shared from the film earlier on, it's like, if we don't appreciate the complexity of life and really honor and revere that as like a daily practice, we're going to continue with these very mediocre and eventually very damaging supposed solutions. And I think what the film really points to is the fact that we need to have deeper responses to the challenges of our time. There shouldn't have to be a reason for fish hatcheries and fish farms, because we should be able to meter the amount of fish that we're eating. People who rely on fish and need it for their day and their livelihoods, that's one thing. But living, you walk past like an Itsu or these sushi places living in London, and it's massive amount of fish everywhere that feels so unnecessary to the livelihoods. And again, going back to the confusion, I think there's a lot of confusion between people of, the effects of wild fish and farmed fish. I'll hear people at dinner saying, oh, I'm going to get that because it's farmed, assuming that because it's farmed, it's not going to have an impact on the environment. So yeah, I think the more that these stories can get out there, just the better. So thank you so much. And Leanne, I was thinking what Paul was saying about igniting and empowering the next generation of river restorers and river guardians, and I wanted to ask you to share more about drinkable rivers, because it feels like it's practical. I feel like we need big storytelling, lobbying, and also practical application of ecosystem restoration. So how could people go into their local environments and get started restoring their rivers? Not their rivers, but the rivers.
Maybe then in line with the storytelling, just a little sentence of storytelling of when I was 24, I canoed a whole river for a month that was drinkable. So every day I could drink, and it was such a new appreciation of beauty, and of what is normal. This is actually normal. And our tap water, it's quite genius that we can build these millions of kilometers of pipeline and simplify life, supposedly. But then when I returned to this river 3 years later, this is the Rupert River in Canada, it was not drinkable anymore. And that was from a whole mix, a cocktail of so-called economic developments, of forestry coming first, then mining, silver mining, where they had used mercury. And then they were building a dam for hydroelectricity, and that distorted the whole balance. And then the mercury became a problem, and the beautiful, healthy, drinkable river was lost. And so then I, as a 24-year-old, it changed my perspective. And so, and I started to make it as my personal compass. And later on, I started to build this, like, this could be our societal compass, because everywhere around the world, we're dependent on water, and all around the world, people are living within watersheds. We're part of these river families all around the world. So in the line of experiencing our rivers again, we grow our understanding and our love for our rivers and our oceans, and therefore that will be a basis to care. And so that's what we are promoting and trying to ignite with drinkable rivers. And what I said earlier, to ask this question, to now transition to make it more practical. will this action, this material that I'm using, what I'm doing, will it help contribute to a world with more flowable, swimmable, full of salmon, fish, and drinkable rivers, or not? And then be consistent in these steps. All these small steps will add up to something very big. And then the appreciation, the growing of our respect. One very practical thing that we could do, that I learned from Mona Polaka, one of the indigenous elders, is to thank our water before using. And so that will just change something whenever we flush a toilet, when we drink something, when we are washing something, when we're even eating. Then we, with this functional relationship, we can grow also more this relationship of respect, because our rivers already start. We are every source. With us, the rivers start as well. With our sink, the rivers start. With our toilet, the rivers start. And so also with all our actions. And one of those actions could be this growing of respect. So.
I can say quite briefly that from California, with our water woes last year, we were thanking water all the time, because we almost
beautiful
in our reservoirs. So it's you make a very good point. It's we feel it here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Leanne. Matt, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the work that you've been doing based in the UK, and if you've seen any positive effects from the campaigning that's been occurring, and how, perhaps what you're seeing as the biggest obstacle to the necessary changes occurring from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you. It's been really interesting working on the campaign for over 2 years now. And in some ways, we've had a lot of successes. I feel like we've been really good at raising awareness with people and consumers. And I think more people know about an issue with salmon now than ever before. But it's been quite hard because things haven't changed. And we realized that we're up against really big money. And there's a lot of lying going on. We mentioned before about the lying on the packaging, saying that these are responsible or sustainable products. But also, the most polluting industries spend the most money on lobbying. And we've seen that with tobacco, and then we've seen that with fossil fuels. And the salmon industry is making billions of pounds, centralized, mega profits. And they're lobbying, and they're getting governments to change regulation. So in Scotland, these reports have come out saying that salmon farming is good for the economy, and it's particularly good for local economies, local communities that are in sort of remote places in Scotland and really need an economic uplift. But all the reports they've been putting out, they just show the money being made. They don't account for any of the costs happening to the environment. And when we were driving on the coast of Scotland and interviewing people, we know that lots of other people are suffering, whether it's wildlife tourism, or if it's small-scale creel fishing, or if it's oyster farming. All these other businesses that can't afford lobbyists, their profits are completely collapsing. I mean, in some cases, they're not going to have a business if the locks get much more polluted. So we just, it can be very disheartening when you realize you're coming up against these big economic entities that can kind of outgun us. And Marks and Spencer's, which is the main supermarket we were talking to, in the end, even when we delivered a petition with 100,000 people, they just said, we don't acknowledge there's a problem. We're not going to change our branding. We're not going to stop calling it responsible. So we're going through a phase now of stepping back and going, what's the next move? And it's really cool to be here talking with everyone. And I think we've just got to keep sharing ideas and keep pushing and keep fighting, because it's terrifying to think this industry is still expanding.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you. Leah, do you have anything to add from that about, the obstacles that are facing people campaigning for change within oceans and within rivers? Like when Ruby and my sister first started Advaya 5, 6, 7 years ago, I never would have thought that I'd be ever talking about economics and the economy and capitalism, and I just never thought it would be something that Advaya would be talking about, because we were into the community and spirituality and well-being and ecology. but every single event that we ever did over the first 3 years kept coming back to the economic structures that we're living within, and it's like just constantly, it almost feels like you get to a dead end until we started researching and running events around how to transform the economy, and you realize, like with everything, there are so many different paths forward towards healing and balance and thriving cultures. But yeah, anyway, I just wanted to ask from your perspective, Leah, what you see as a big obstacle, and if you see things starting to shift in response to increasing public pressure.
Yeah. I feel like we're at a really interesting point where there's a lot of chaos, actually. And, you know, with that and with the transformation that's taking place, ultimately we need a big systems change. And we're seeing these like very old structures and then people demanding, you know, a new way of doing things that really put nature at the center of it. And although it can be very, you know, you can feel super angry at times and it can be very overwhelming, I think that we're at a really interesting point too, where people are listening more than they have ever before. You know, I believe there's 200 people that are tuning into this discussion here today, and that gives hope. And I think for those communities that are on the ground, documenting and sharing what is happening, and being able to, you know, we have a storyteller on here today with Paul. It's like you're able to really share this in a different way. And that's really what gives me hope at the end of the day, that things are starting to change, because people are starting to become aware and become actively involved in these conversations. And I think that's where that multi-stakeholder engagement needs to take place, and starting to, you know, think about, or more holistically about, how everyone is starting to interact with all these different topics.
Beautiful, thank you so much. For the last question, I'd love to go around. If you could take just a minute each to share, I don't know, a piece of advice, a practice, an action that you would like to share with anyone watching this video. Paul, I'll hand over to you.
My last remark would be find, start, grow, reimagine your relationship with your local river. It doesn't matter where you're at. Civilizations follow rivers, creeks, watersheds, and in any way that you can, just start or grow, reimagine the relationship you have with that watershed, because when you're interacting with that watershed, it's a lot harder for you not to care. It's a lot harder for you not to see the financing, to see the impacts of any of the things that we talked about today, and find other people, inspire other people to do the same.
Perfect, thank you. Leanne.
Well, besides the thanking of the water before using, something practical and something that we haven't talked in this watery film and watery discussion is the soil. And so we can really contribute to healthy soils and building up our soils. Okay, wherever you are, you can compost. And so that's something very practical, where we can be really every day do something in a regenerational way, and that way also acting systemically by seeing the relationship with our own food that we're using, have that as organic and chemical free as possible, and then compost.
Thank you. To Matt?
Yeah, I would encourage everyone to communicate with the place that they buy their food. That could be a big supermarket or wherever it is. These companies are very sensitive to what their customers are thinking and doing. And I just ask them, you know, you're stocking salmon. How confident are you that it's ethical, you know, the business, and how does it work? It can also be good to ask those questions on social media. And we should all talk about it with our friends and families. I mean, a lot of people still think that farmed salmon in a supermarket is a health food or is better to eat because it's not from a wild stock. And I think, yeah, just having those conversations is really crucial.
Fabulous, thank you. Leia?
I think it's start thinking about just your impact on the environment, your daily choices, and really starting to put people and planet at the center of it, looking at prioritizing all life on Earth as that center point.
Thank you. And finally, over to you, Josh.
Well, I would say I'm deeply conflicted as a filmmaker because I make and tell stories. But when people stop at the story, I feel like I haven't done my job. And so if there's one thing I would say, do something. Don't just watch, do. Reach out, touch your water, encourage drinkable water, find packaging, look at do something. Don't just watch. We have such huge issues that as storytellers we get to address, but my job is to make a movement, not a movie. And if I only make a movie, I feel like I've failed. And in this case, there's so much to do locally, internationally. I mean, ask lots of questions. That's another thing, because when you ask questions, you find out amazing things. When people say that salmon is sustainable as it's farmed presently in open ocean, and depending on where they get the feedstock, you start to say, well, what does that mean, right? Because what we do know, and this is crazy, you probably don't know this from the film, of course, but many of these salmon farms are buying feed that comes from wild fish that are harvested off of Brazil, mixed with legumes or soybeans from largely deforested rainforest areas in Brazil, churned up into a feed, sent to Scotland, where the fish were imported from Norway, fed to those Scottish fish, harvested, sent to China for processing, then sent back all over the world. The carbon footprint of the salmon farmed industry in Norway is larger than all of its citizens travel. That's how huge this is. But most people don't say that. They just look at the label and say, sustainable, good. So I would encourage people. I know we all have busy lives, but where we can, if you really believe in something, take a stand, ask questions, and share that with people, because the sharing of information through story is the most powerful thing we can do. Well, we've already seen it, unfortunately, in parts of our country. When story is more important than fact, we throw out fact for story. We have to balance fact and story, but we have to tell those most powerful stories with as many people we can. So please watch and then do.
Thank you so much to our amazing panelists. And I'd like to say to everyone watching, go and find out more about their brilliant work. But, they do so many incredible things in this world. And yet I think so powerful that this aspect of telling story and of learning, asking questions and of taking action in your daily life. Tomorrow, Guardians of the River starts. This is a 3-month online course. We do bursaries for anyone really who needs concessionary prices. It's going to be 2 weekly sessions for most of the weeks, looking at somatic, spiritual, legal, practical, cultural approaches to river guardianship, water kinship, and whatever that means. So that starts tomorrow, and we'll have a community platform, and you can catch up with the recordings if you can't join them live. We've got many incredible people joining from around the world to teach us in this vast topic, transformative topic. I just wanted to end by saying that there's something about artificial which I love. One of the things is the line, it says the road to extinction is paved with good intentions, and I just think that's brilliant, because it's very easy to think that the ecological crisis is being created by people who are in essence know they are doing something wrong and continue. And I don't think that's the case. I think it's a lot of people genuinely think the things that we're doing are right. And I think when we can start to understand better through storytelling what impact these supposed solutions are having on local communities, on human beings, on human rights, on people's access to clean water, clean air, forest, nutritious food, that is something that we can really connect with. It's a the humans are at the center of the ecological crisis and the impact, as well as ecosystems. If people can't connect so much with ecosystems, perhaps they can with the human story. And I think that's very, very important to come back to local communities rather than these more globalized narratives of supposed solutions and pathways that are led by technology and which aren't intelligent enough to make the necessary change. That's what I would want to lead with, and just to thank everyone around the world who is taking beautiful actions every day, and to thank our incredible panelists and to everyone behind the brilliant film Artificial, and Josh for kind of igniting that whole journey of getting it. Thank everyone.
Thank you.
Water is essential for all life. It is a source of deeply interwoven planetary and bodily connection through the rivers, oceans, and weather systems upon which we depend. Without water, there is no life. Rivers are the lifeblood of the planet and the architects of the landscape. Their pathways give rise to communities, both human and more than human, that depend on their continued health and flow. Can we begin to understand our relation to rivers as sources of life, as blood, as crucial as the air we breathe? Can we begin to see rivers as something more than a resource, but instead as a sacred source of being? Guardians of the River is a transformational online course led by Indigenous teachers, scientists, ecologists, land justice activists, community leaders, and water defenders from many nations around the world. Whether you are interested in environmentalism, nature reconnection, community building, activism, art, environmental law, or simply looking for inspiration, this course is designed to change the way we understand our relationship to rivers in an age of ecological crisis. Join us and learn about rights of rivers, riverside, water kinship, community building, and approaches to environmental, land, and social justice. It is time we unite with global river guardians.